The blurb in our newsletter said of this service, "We uphold a living tradition that has had a footing in Victoria since at least 1911. We've been served by interesting ministers and lay leaders and been housed in at least 4 buildings. Since our founding in 1996, Capital Unitarian Universalist Congregation has also been home to several ministerial prospects, who I will talk about later. Since writing that blurb and doing more research for this talk, I've learned many interesting facts and impressions about the Unitarian presence in Victoria. I want to share all those facts and impressions during the next 3 hours. Just kidding, I have 15 minutes. In this 15 minutes, I want to tell you a thumbnail sketch of the Unitarian history of Victoria. I want to tell you about the ministers and ministerial prospects who have called Capital their spiritual home. And I want to say a few words about what makes a minister. There are records of Unitarians in Victoria since 1909, and a Unitarian minister being here in 1911. In Victoria, we had a minister from 1911 till 1919, and then we were lay-led. In 1950, a new group began with monthly discussion group meetings, and the leader called it the Liberal Religious Fellowship of Victoria. In 1955, don't have to remember any of this, there's no test, Reverend Philip Hewitt was hired as the minister in Vancouver, and he also came to Victoria periodically to give spiritual guidance to this Liberal Religious Fellowship. Such that in 1958 we had a charter registration with 38 new members. From 58 to 1960, the congregation met at what is now called the Castleview Childcare Centre on Joan Crescent near the Craigdare Castle. Then it was called the School for Retarded Children, and I'm sure there were Unitarians who joked about why the Unitarians were meeting there. Believe it or not, there was Mount Tolmie Community Hall was our home for 3 years. But it was, the historians recall that it was unsatisfactory and unattractive. So we met at the War Amps Hall for a few years, and I could not find out where the War Amps Hall is because it doesn't exist now.
Peter, would you like a slide up right now with the dates?
Oh, thank you. I was going to say, slide should come.
It's all good. We're the dream team, that's what we are.
Again, you don't have to memorize any of this. But there's the charter registration in 1958, 38 new members. In 1966, Unitarians bought the Siemens Hall 106 Superior Street for $30,000. And now it's Il Covo Restaurant, so that when we sold it in 1993, we got $460,000 for it. And the year after that, the Unitarians bought a former Wellness Institute building on West Saanich Road for almost $1 million, and then it needed work and about another $500,000 in renovations. So we've had several places that we've met. This congregation has been meeting in this room for its entire 27-year history since March 1996. And we've also, the congregation, the Unitarians of Victoria, have had many ministers. Grant Butler was the minister at large for a few years. Marvin Evans came here directly from theological school with the promise of being paid well, and we couldn't pay him well. He was paid under the prescribed amount from the Unitarian Association, and he hung out and stayed as long as he could, but when we couldn't pay him anymore, he had to leave. Stanley Sears was here as minister for a while, and then Felix Lyon, who had marched at Selma, Alabama with Dr. King, served as the minister in Victoria and retired in Victoria. During breaks in professional ministry, the Reverend Dr. Philip Hewitt would come over from Vancouver and do services to keep the Victoria flame burning. And he was in fact interim minister for a while. 1993 was a big time in the history because the Reverend Van Knight came. Van Knight had been a Baptist minister, in the United States, had cross-trained as a Unitarian, and came to be our minister for 8 years. And I learned a lot about Van through the historical records. He was dynamic. He grew the congregation. Soon there were 3 services during the week, 2 services on a Sunday and a discussion group like our forum on Thursdays. We outgrew the Superior Street building, which is now Il Covo Restaurant, and started looking for another place. One bit of wisdom I got just before the service began is that Christine Johnson, where are you, Christine? Christine was the president of the congregation then, and was Van Knight's last congregational president, and talked about the work that he did. The Wellness Institute on West Saanich Road was purchased and developed, but there were some Unitarians who didn't want to move out of James Bay. So a group of 8 people left. They actually left under a cloud. That's another story for another homily. And Van Knight, the minister, and Keith Jobson, a law professor, tried to bring peace so that if a new congregation was going to start, it wouldn't start in anger, but would start with an open heart. So that was Van Knight. This congregation has not had a minister, but we've inspired ministers. Our first music director was Ian Riddell. And Ian Riddell is currently the lead minister of the UU Church of the Desert in Rancho Mirage near Palm Springs. And there are hymns by Ian Riddell in our hymnals. I should say that in 2000, we had a brief, we called a minister for Capital Congregation, Dick Hasty. Dick was actually retired already. He agreed to come here for a 3-month term. He and his husband Richard. There's nothing in the records about what Richard and Dick did for this congregation, except that in the year 2000, Dick Hasty's appointment made news because he was an out gay man as a minister. And that kind of put Capital on the radar that we were going to be a welcoming congregation. So I've talked about Ian Riddell, David Doubledown. When I joined this congregation 20 years ago, David was singing in the choir. Beautiful voice. He belonged to both congregations. And while participating in the Gay Pride Festival in James Bay, he was entranced by another David, David Devan, who was the manager of Pacific Opera Victoria. They fell in love and married here in Victoria and moved to Philadelphia, where Opera David is the general director and president of Opera Philadelphia. Unitarian David found himself with lots of spare time, so he went to divinity school and became a Unitarian minister. I searched to see if he's serving a congregation right now, and there's no mention of it. Rosemary Morrison, some of us remember Rosemary from not too long ago. She used to attend the United Church in Kamloops. She moved to Victoria and started attending services right here at Capital. She was encouraged to give a homily that was based partly on her many years as a social worker. She liked to be at the pulpit. She asked, "Can I do that again?" And we said, "Yeah." This congregation also made her a lay chaplain, and Rosemary loved conducting rites of passage. Rosemary attended Vancouver School of Theology, and upon graduation served as a congregation in Tippecanoe County in Indiana, and she is now the minister at the Unitarian Church of Edmonton. Got her start here. Aaron Liddell Morton was a member of Capital. Some of us remember he was briefly a lay chaplain before taking a Sunday morning job at the First Unitarian Church. He started attending seminary online from Cherry Hill in South Carolina, and is now the part-time minister at Comox Valley Unitarian Fellowship. He's not a reverend yet. That's still on the way, but he can be called minister. And I can't do this list without mentioning Amanda, our director of congregational life, who came to Capital in 2000, gave her first homily 3 weeks later. She remembers that her knees were knocking audibly. 6 months later, she became a lay chaplain and started doing weddings and funerals. But not only is Amanda central to this congregation, Since 2008, she has been serving the Salt Spring Island Unitarian congregation, doing Sunday services, administration, and rites of passage. We've also had, also notable, I mentioned on the slide, Reverend Dick Hasty briefly in 2000, the Reverend Francis Deverell, who's retired on the island now and a good friend of Karen. While Francis was a divinity student, she had already trained, she had been working as a management consultant, and she came here to try and help this congregation. We were having some difficulty with communication. So she was attending Beacon congregation in Lower Mainland, and she brought communication guidelines to help us communicate better. And we still use those and we call them the Beacon communication guidelines, but they could just as easily be called the Deverell communication guidelines. Student Jen Devine was a divinity student at First Unitarian Church and spent half of her time with us. So that was in 2005, 2006, and we gained insight from her. She is still not a Rev, but is still active in Unitarian circles. And I also want to mention the Reverend Alan Merson, who was a Unitarian minister who lived in Victoria, attended our services, and preached occasionally from this pulpit. He would wear a collar only when he was speaking. He wasn't our minister, but he took care of a lot of people in this congregation when we needed someone who had some training. And finally, the United Church, Reverend Don Hume. Don Hume had left the United Church, and his good friend, the Reverend Jane Bramadat, said, "Come to Capital, they'll completely accept you." He attended all of our services and social events, but was not our minister. However, Don was never shy about telling me what I was doing wrong when I spoke here. Sometimes while I was speaking. In March 2017, Don's homily, Reflections of a Drug Addict, about his troubles with crack cocaine, addiction, and recovery, was memorable for its candor. So I've told you some about what Unitarian buildings we've had and what ministers we've had. In the last few minutes, I want to tell you about what ministers can do. I started writing this and I thought, I'm not the first person who needs to write this. So the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist Association, has lots of resources about choosing a minister and what a minister does. And I couldn't have said it better. Ministers are spiritual leaders of our faith communities. They help us to explore life's questions, challenge us to live out our values, and comfort us in times of suffering. Ministers teach, preach, listen, and learn by leading congregations, serving as chaplains, and working for justice in the community. UU ministers are a diverse group. They may include people of different genders and sexualities and certainly different beliefs. And ministers serve in a variety of settings, in congregations and beyond. And lately, ministers have been serving by Zoom as well, Zoom and telephone. What else do ministers do? All congregationally based ministers lead in partnership with members of the congregation, because the members of a congregation get to choose whom they call to settle as a minister. This is because of our commitment to congregational polity. We have no bishop who sends us a minister. We have advisors who can find ministers for us, but it's up to us to find them and choose them. What else do ministers do? 5 years ago, as part of an oral history project, I interviewed 20 retired ministers. One of the many things I learned is that Sunday morning, the marquee event, like our Sunday service, is a small part of a cleric's job. Ministers spend little time writing and delivering sermons. They spend most of their waking hours attending committee meetings, answering and generating email, doing house visits, going to hospital to visit sick congregants, and driving, and driving, and driving, and driving. We Unitarians demand that our ministers stay up to date on social justice issues, and we like them to be well read, so reading is part of what we pay ministers to do. So in conclusion, mindful of the annual general meeting that we will conduct after this service, in Victoria, Unitarians have had several buildings. the greatest stability in our 100 years has been while the two congregations have met at 5575 West Saanich Road for almost 30 years, and at the James Bay New Horizons for 27 years now. We could move again if that's deemed beneficial for the vitality of our congregation, because the congregation is the people, not the place. The Unitarians of Victoria have been through ups and downs during the past 100 years. We have employed or inspired dozens of ministers. At the West Saanich Road Church, there is no doubt in my mind that there have been countless advantages to the professional ministries of the Reverend Jane Bramadat, the Reverend Don Von Forster, and the Reverends Shauna and Melora Lingood. Capital UU congregation could benefit from professional ministerial leadership. I wanted to provide you with a brief history of Victoria Unitarians, our buildings, and our ministers. I'm delighted to share these interesting facts and impressions. So today, mindful of our history, let us make good decisions on our future path. In that spirit, I've asked Dick, Kathy, and Attila to teach us how we make the path by walking in a song by